Here is the thing no one tells you first. In 1830, the average American adult drank more than 7 gallons of distilled spirits every single year. Not beer, not wine. Distilled spirits, whiskey, rum, gin. That is more than 3 times what Americans consume today. Whiskey appeared at breakfast tables before the cornmeal was even stirred. Hard cider went into the children's cups because water was genuinely not safe to drink from most wells and streams. This was not considered excess. It was not considered a problem. It was considered an ordinary morning, and the jug sat near the fire to take the chill off it, and life continued. The kitchen smells of ash, and something deeper. Lard rendered from last autumn's hog, pooled solid in a brown crock near the hearth, carries the particular smell of animal fat gone cold overnight. Not unpleasant, familiar, foundational. Dried herbs hang in dusty bundles from the ceiling beams. Sage and thyme and something that was once pennyroyal, now grey with age. The walls have absorbed years of cooking smoke, and they give it back slowly in the dark. A warmth that is not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth, and it settles around you as you stand in the doorway of an American kitchen in the early years of the 19th century, and try to understand what you are seeing. The fire has gone low in the night. This is your first task, and you know it before you're fully awake. Know it the way you know which floorboard creaks and which one holds. Because the cold has entered the room from the direction of the hearth, and the hearth cold is different from the window cold, drier and heavier. You cross the floor and crouch down and find the coals still alive at their centre, banked the night before under a careful covering of ash, and you lay on the tinder, dried corn cobs, a curl of bark, last week's wood shavings, and blow gently, and the coals breathe back at you, and a small flame appears. This is where the day begins, not with food not yet ready, not with voices not yet awake, with fire, because the fire is everything. Outside, the sky holds its darkness for another hour. The sounds of the farm arrive in layers, a cow settling her weight, the scratch of something small in the woodpile, the particular silence of a house where everyone is still asleep. By the time the flame has steadied on the hearth and the pot of water has been swung over it on the iron crane, you are already planning. The mush needs 20 minutes of stirring. The salt pork should come out of its brine to soak in fresh water before it goes in the pot. The bread sponge from last night needs checking. The children will be down before you're ready, and they will be hungry in the way that children are hungry, which is completely and immediately and without patience. This is an ordinary morning in 1800s America. The kitchen is not remarkable. The food that will come from it is not remarkable. Salt and fire and cornmeal and lard and the long labour of keeping a household fed through a century that offered almost no convenience and required almost everything you had. What happened in this room, at this fire, at this table? It happened 3 times a day, every day for every family on the continent, and the story of it is larger and stranger and more interesting than anyone has ever quite managed to say. Let it begin quietly. The fire is lit. The morning has its instructions. You already know them. The 19th century in America covers a span of time so vast and varied that speaking of it as a single era feels almost dishonest. What people ate in Boston in 1802 bore little resemblance to what people ate in a sod house on the Kansas prairie in 1875, or in a New Orleans Creole kitchen in 1850, or in a Cherokee household in Tennessee before the removal, or in a Chinese mining camp in California in 1852. The continent was enormous and sparsely connected, and the food that appeared on any given table told a story about geography, climate, season, wealth, and heritage in almost equal measure. This century does not have a single table. It has 10,000 of them. What linked all of them, though, was the absence. Before the middle of the century there was no refrigeration, no canning industry operating at scale, no railroad network moving fresh produce in bulk across the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad would not be complete until 1869, and even then its effects on everyday rural eating would take decades to be felt in full. What you ate was largely what you had grown, raised, preserved, or traded for within a few dozen miles of your door. The pantry was not a room where you kept convenience. The pantry was the insurance against winter, carefully calculated every autumn, and watched carefully every February when the calculations sometimes proved wrong. Salt was the great equalizer of the American table. It did not matter whether you lived in a modest farmhouse in Ohio or a prosperous townhouse in Philadelphia. Salt was what stood between you and hunger in the cold months. Pork packed in brine, fish layered with salt in wooden barrels, vegetables turned to pickle in crocks of salted water and left to ferment in the cool dark of the cellar. The taste of the 1800s, if you distilled it to a single element, was salt and smoke and the deep tang of fermentation. These were not flavours added for pleasure. They were preservation technologies, and every American household understood them as clearly as modern households understand how to use a refrigerator. Corn was the foundation on which American eating was built in the first half of this century. More than wheat, more than pork, even in the counting of calories, corn fed the continent. Ground into meal, it became mush and porridge and bread and johnny cake. Dried in its cob, it fed the animals through winter. Fermented, it became whiskey, and whiskey was, as you have already heard, a staple of the American diet in ways that require some adjustment to fully comprehend. Dried and processed in the old Native American method, soaked in lye water to release its hull, corn became hominy, which could be further ground into grits, which fed households from the Carolinas to the Kentucky backcountry for generations before anyone thought to call it Southern food. The question of how food was cooked is inseparable from the question of what got cooked and how much of it survived to reach the table. Through the early decades of the century, most American cooking happened at the open hearth. A fireplace wide enough in some homes to stand inside, equipped with iron cranes that swung pots over the flames, adjustable hooks at varying heights, and brick ovens built into the chimney wall for bread. By the 1840s and 1850s, cast-iron cook stoves were spreading through American homes with remarkable speed, carried along the expanding networks of canals and then railroads, and they changed not just the mechanics of cooking, but what was possible to cook, how precisely it could be done, and how much wood the operation required. The stove did not arrive quietly. It arrived and rearranged the kitchen. The American diet of this era was also profoundly seasonal in ways that modern eating cannot fully replicate, even for those who try. Seasonal eating in the 1800s was not a philosophy or a farmer's market lifestyle. It was a physical fact governed by the absence of refrigeration and the limits of transportation. Spring brought the first green things after months of preserved food, wild ramps, dandelion greens, young nettles, the first lettuces from the kitchen garden, and families greeted them with something close to biological relief, because the body, after a winter of salt pork and cornmeal and dried beans, understood what it needed before the mind did. Autumn brought the pressure of abundance. Every vegetable not put up now would not exist in January, and January was always coming. The cooking was done almost entirely by women. This is not the whole story, and the whole story is worth naming briefly. Enslaved cooks prepared extraordinary quantities of food in southern households, and created or adapted much of what would eventually be recognized as American cuisine, from the techniques of deep frying to the use of okra to the particular flavoring of beans and greens with smoked pork. Their contributions were enormous, and their acknowledgement in the historical record was almost nothing. Frontier men cooked from necessity with varying results. But in the ordinary American household, the kitchen was the woman's domain, and the knowledge she carried was the knowledge her mother had carried, in fragments of instruction, in receipts copied into household ledgers, in adjustments made by feel and smell and the look of a batter in the bowl. Receipts, what we call recipes, existed in this century, but they were different from modern recipes in one important way. They assumed the reader already knew most of what they needed to know. A receipt from an 1840s American cookbook might tell you to bake your bread in a moderate oven, which meant nothing unless you already understood the 50 ways that wood fires created moderate ovens and how to tell one from another. It might tell you to add a wine glass of molasses, which meant nothing unless you knew that wine glasses varied by a factor of 3 or 4 between households. The receipts were not instructions for beginners. They were memory aids for people who had already been taught by standing in someone else's kitchen and watching, and they filled in only the parts that memory might slip. What you will find in the kitchen of the 1800s, if you spend real time in it, is not the spare and monotonous diet that the historical summary sometimes suggests. There was monotony. The winter months, particularly, pressed hard on the variety of what was possible, but there was also ingenuity, adaptation, creativity born from constraint, and a deep pleasure in the particular textures and flavours that this food, cooked this way, in this era, produced. Pork fat rendered clear and poured over biscuits, cornbread eaten with pot liquor from the bean pot, maple syrup thick and amber over a bowl of hasty pudding still steaming from the fire, Apple butter spread on bread still warm from the oven. The pleasures were real, they were just earned differently. Settle in then, the fire is lit, the mush is already thickening, the salt pork is giving up its brine to a pot of cold water. Somewhere in the house a child is beginning to stir, and the dog has already decided the morning is official and is lying as close to the hearth as you will allow. The sentry opens its kitchen to you. What you find inside it will take the whole night to tell. The sound of a good cooking fire is different from the sound of a fire burning purely for heat, and you learn the difference early, in the way you learn most things in this century. Through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of mornings. A fire for heat wants to roar and push back the cold. A fire for cooking wants to breathe steadily, to sustain itself over hours, to offer even temperatures to the pots suspended above it. It needs spaces of intense heat for the boiling pot and spaces of gentler warmth for the simmering pot, and these spaces must coexist without either one suffering, which is a kind of management that most people in 1800s America performed without thinking about it at all, because it was simply what fire meant. The open hearth was the centre of the American home through most of the early 1800s. In many smaller farmhouses, it was not simply where cooking happened, it was the primary source of light and heat as well, which meant the fireplace was managing 3 essential functions simultaneously, and all of them required constant attention. A wide hearth, 4 or 5 feet across in many farmhouses, offered multiple cooking stations, a hot end for boiling water and large pots, a cooler end for keeping finished food warm, the iron crane that could swing pots away from or directly over the flames, and the low bed of ember that formed against the back of the firebox and provided a steadier, more reliable heat than open flame for long, slow cooking. You knew the fire by smell as much as by sight. A good cooking fire smelled of seasoned hardwood, oak or hickory or apple in the northeast and midwest, live oak or pecan in the south, cedar and pine on the frontier, burning clean and even, releasing a smoke that was almost sweet in the way hardwood smoke can be, and this smell was so constant in an 1800s household that the people who lived in it stopped noticing it almost entirely. It was just the smell of the house, the smell of shelter. A fire burning too hot for cooking had a sharper, drier quality to its smoke, and you caught it in your throat before you registered it in your mind. A fire going cold had a particular wet heaviness, and you moved to tend it without deciding to. The management of fire temperature was done through a vocabulary of iron. The crane, a horizontal iron arm hinged to the chimney wall on a vertical pivot, allowed you to swing your pots in and out of the flames or over them, which gave you a rough version of the control a modern cook achieves by turning a dial. Hung from the crane were pot hooks and hooks in various lengths, so you could raise or lower a pot by swapping the hook it hung from, which changed its distance from the flame and thus its temperature. A long-handled trammel, an adjustable hooked device, could be set to keep a pot at a precise distance from the coals, and a skilled cook used these 3 variables together: position on the crane, height of the hook, and the fire's own behaviour at that moment, to produce results that required no thermometer, because the cook's body was the thermometer. Iron was also the vocabulary of the pots themselves. A cast-iron Dutch oven was the most versatile piece of equipment in the kitchen, a deep-lidded vessel that could sit directly in coals, hang from a crane, or be buried under a mound of raked embers for the long, slow bakes that produced the best bread. Its lid had a raised rim so you could pile hot coals on top as well as beneath, which created the heat from above and below that an open hearth otherwise struggled to provide. A cast-iron spider, a skillet with 3 or 4 short legs, stood in the coals with its legs keeping it just above the ash while heat came up around it from all sides. A griddle, flat and smooth, rested on 2 bricks set at the fire's edge for johnny cakes and cornbread, and the flat corn porridge cakes that went by a dozen different names, depending on where you were standing on the continent. What is worth understanding about hearth cooking, and what most accounts of it miss, is how much of it happened in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Not simply hot and cool, not simply flame and ember, but height above the coals, the angle and position of the crane, the weight and density of what was being cooked as those qualities changed over hours. A large iron pot of dried beans and water weighed differently at noon than it did at 5 in the afternoon, because the water had been evaporating for 6 hours, and the beans had absorbed what remained of it. and that change in weight and density affected how the iron held and distributed heat, which affected whether the beans at the centre of the pot cooked at the same rate as the beans near the surface. The cook who managed this successfully did not necessarily understand it in the language of physics. She understood it in the sound of a simmer versus a boil, the colour and frequency of the steam, the way the lid lifted slightly when the heat was right. Baking at the open hearth was a separate skill from pot cooking, and it demanded its own kind of attention. Brick ovens, built into the chimney wall beside the main firebox, were heated by burning a fire inside them for 2 to 4 hours, until the bricks absorbed enough heat to bake a week's worth of bread. When the fire burned down, you raked out the ash, checked the temperature by feel, your arm in the oven for a count of 10, your hand hovering at the opening for 5 seconds, or a small piece of white paper that should turn light brown but not dark in 30 seconds, and then slid in the loaves on a long-handled wooden peel. The oven door was sealed with a board or iron plate, and the bread baked in the stored heat of the bricks, which decreased gradually over the following hours. This was why serious baking happened once a week at most. Heating a brick oven required planning and wood and a clear afternoon. The shift from open hearth to cast iron cook stove happened gradually through the 1840s and 1850s and was one of the most significant changes in American domestic life in the century. The stove, a closed iron box with a firebox inside, holes in the top surface covered by removable rings, and a flue pipe connecting to the existing chimney, used dramatically less wood than the open hearth for the same amount of cooking. It concentrated its heat rather than radiating it openly in all directions. It gave the cook more control. Removing a ring brought a pot over direct flame. Leaving rings in place kept heat more indirect and diffuse. The oven, a separate compartment beside or below the firebox, maintained heat more evenly than a brick oven and required no preheating beyond an hour or two. But the stove arrived with its own learning curve, and the women who had mastered the hearth over decades found the stove temperamental in different ways than the fire had been. The firebox was small and particular about fuel size, too large a piece of wood, and the temperature climbed past what delicate baking needed. Too small a piece and the fire dropped before you wanted it to. The draft lever that controlled airflow changed everything about the flame's behaviour in ways that were not intuitive if you had spent your life reading an open fire. The oven thermometer did not exist as a household object in the 1840s, and the receipts in the cookbooks that accompanied the new stoves described oven temperatures as hot, moderate, or slow, which was helpful if you understood those categories in relation to the stove you owned, and not at all helpful if you did not. There is a receipt from an 1845 American cookbook, one of the first to address the new stoves rather than the old hearth, that instructs the baker to test her oven by inserting her hand and counting to 20. If she can hold it there for the full 20 count, the oven is moderate. If she pulls it away at 10, the oven is hot. If she can hold it past 30, the oven is slow and she should add wood and wait. This is the entire instruction. It assumed the reader had already learned, through experience, what bread needed at each of those temperatures, and that she understood how her particular stove behaved, and that she could make the adjustment between knowledge and execution in real time, with her hand in an oven and a family waiting for supper. By whatever method of cooking, the fire's first requirement was wood, and wood was a constant occupation of the American household. Cutting, splitting, stacking, drying, and carrying wood was primarily men's work. Hours of it, every week, every season, throughout the year. Hardwood needed to be cut in autumn and dried through the following year before it was ready to burn cleanly. Green wood burned wet and filled a kitchen with acrid smoke, and left thick creosote on chimney walls that could catch fire in the night. A farm family's woodpile was as carefully tended as the root cellar, which is to say it was tended the way you tend anything that stands between you and disaster, which is to say constantly. In summer, the kitchen fire created a different problem. The heat of the hearth or stove in the months of July and August turned the kitchen into a room that required something very close to courage to work in, and the women who cooked through summer in the pre-cook stove era, bent over an open hearth in wool and linen in a room with no ventilation beyond the door, were doing something physically demanding that the historical record tends to summarize in a sentence if it mentions it at all. Summer kitchens, separate small buildings built away from the main house specifically to contain the cooking heat, were common on prosperous farms in the mid-century period, and the transition of cooking activity from the main house to the summer kitchen and back again marked the turning of the year as surely as the appearance of spring greens. Evening came, and the fire needed banking. You raked the coals to the centre of the hearth, covered them with a thick layer of ash, and this slow suffocation preserved the fire's heart through the hours of darkness. On the stove, you shut the draught and let the firebox close in on itself. The kitchen cooled quickly once the fire was down and the smells of the day settled into the walls. The fat of the morning's pork, the starch of the evening's cornmeal, the thin ghost of wood smoke that never entirely left an 1800s kitchen, regardless of how much the windows were opened or how many years the house stood. This smell was so constant and so daily that people who grew up with it did not notice it at all. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of what time felt like when it moved slowly and fed people as it went. In the morning you would return to the banked coals and find the fire still living at its centre, a red glow the size of a fist under a cap of grey ash, and you would blow it gently back to life, and the day would begin again in the same order. Mush pot, water, bread check, salt pork, and the fire would build, and the kitchen would warm, and the sounds of the household coming awake would arrive one at a time in the particular order they always arrived, and you would move through the room with a kind of certainty that was not confidence exactly, but competence earned through so many mornings of the same that the fire and you had come to an understanding, and the understanding held. Cornmeal mush was the most eaten food in 1800s America, and almost no one today would recognize it as a meal worth sitting down for. It was made by stirring cornmeal into boiling salted water and keeping it moving, constantly for 20 minutes or more, until it thickened from a loose slurry into something dense and pale yellow and fragrant, with the particular sweetness of cooked corn. It was served hot in bowls with whatever accompaniment the household could offer, a ladle of milk, a spoonful of molasses, a piece of salt pork lying against the side. It was the morning meal in a very large percentage of American homes through most of this century. It was also the supper, sometimes, when supper was light, and it appeared under the names hasty pudding and samp and porridge and cornmeal porridge, depending on the region and the household and how thick you had managed to make it. You stirred it with a long wooden spoon or paddle, because the mush at the bottom of the pot had a tendency to scorch against the hot iron if you let it sit for even a few minutes without attention. This was the rhythm of the morning. Stir and watch and stir and check the fire and stir, while simultaneously beginning the rest of breakfast. The mush demanded presence. It would not be ignored. And the smell of it cooking, the sweet, slightly nutty smell of cornmeal in hot water releasing its starches, was one of the first smells of the American morning for most of the century. A smell so common in so many kitchens that it became almost indistinguishable from the smell of the hour itself. Corn was the grain of America, and cornmeal was its flour. Wheat flour existed and was treasured. Wheat bread, white or close to it, was a marker of prosperity and aspiration throughout the century, but wheat required different soil and different climate than corn, and in large parts of the Midwest, the Upper South and the frontier, corn was what the land gave willingly, and wheat was what you bought when you could afford to. The gristmill, where whole dried corn was ground between heavy stone wheels into coarse yellow or white meal, was among the most important buildings in any rural community. A family brought their shelled corn to the mill and paid the miller in a portion of the meal, the toll, and carried the rest home in cloth sacks to store in the dry dark of the kitchen until it was needed, which was every morning. Cornbread in the 1800s was not the square of sweet yellow cake that modern recipes sometimes produce. It was denser, more savoury, made with very little sugar if any, mixed with eggs and buttermilk or plain water and lard, and a leavening agent that varied by era and region. In the early part of the century, before baking soda became widely available, the leavening for quick breads often came from pearl ash, potassium carbonate refined from wood ash, which gave a slightly bitter, chemical taste that experienced bakers knew how to balance. Some families kept a sourdough starter, a live culture of wild yeast that required daily feeding and produced bread with a gentle tang that no other method could replicate. The starter was as much a member of the household as the dog. It needed tending. It could die if neglected, and losing a good starter was a minor domestic grief. Baking soda, saleratus, as it was often called in the 1840s and 1850s when it first became commercially available, changed American baking more than any single development before the electric oven. Suddenly a cook did not need a hot brick oven or a 2-day sourdough rise to produce a leavened bread. She needed only the chemical reaction between the soda and an acid ingredient, buttermilk, vinegar, soured milk, to produce a reliable rise in any bread or cake or biscuit that went into the heat. Biscuits in particular became a daily bread in the American household, only after saleratus made them practical. Before it, a biscuit required a starter or a starter's waiting time, or an oven temperature that most daily cooking could not achieve. After it, biscuits could be made in 20 minutes, and baked in the same cast-iron skillet you used for the morning's pork fat. The biscuit was, and remains, a particular thing. Not the hardships biscuit of sailors, not the sweet British biscuit, but the soft, layered buttermilk American biscuit that required cold fat cut into flour, minimal handling, and high heat to produce its characteristic rise and its tender interior and its golden brown top. Cold lard worked into flour with your fingers until it looked like coarse crumbs, then buttermilk added just until the dough held together, then turned onto a floured board and pressed, not rolled, and cut with a tin cutter or a floured glass rim, and placed in a hot iron skillet or on a baking sheet and put in the oven immediately. The handling was the thing. Too much and the biscuit toughened, the gluten developing where it should not. Too little and the dough came apart. The right amount was not a description. It was a sensation in your hands, learned and stored in the muscles. Wheat bread, yeasted, risen, kneaded, shaped, and baked in a loaf, was the bread of aspiration and occasion in many American households. The bread you made on Saturday for Sunday, the bread you brought out for company. It required a day's planning. The sponge started the night before with warm water and a piece of saved starter dough, or a commercial yeast cake, left to ferment through the night, then mixed with flour and salt and kneaded on the morning and left to rise again, shaped into loaves, left to proof a final time, and baked in a hot oven for 45 minutes to an hour. The smell of wheat bread baking was different from the smell of cornbread, richer, more complex, with a sweetness that came from the yeast's work rather than from any added sugar, and it filled a house in a way that people who grew up with it described for the rest of their lives as the smell of safety. The Johnny cake, also called journey cake or ash cake depending on the method, was a flat cornmeal bread that required almost nothing: cornmeal, water, a little salt, and heat. In its simplest form it was made by stirring cornmeal and salted water into a thick batter, shaping it by hand into flat ovals, and baking them on a hot greased griddle or directly on the blade of a hoe held over the coals, which is where the term hoe cake originated. The cakes were done when the bottom browned and the top dried to a matte surface, and they were eaten immediately, while hot, because they hardened as they cooled in a way that made cold Johnny cake edible but not pleasant. They were the bread of fieldwork and of travel, carried in pockets and saddlebags, eaten wherever the day caught you hungry. Ash cakes went a step further in simplicity. The cornmeal dough was wrapped in corn husks or green leaves and buried directly in the hot ash at the edge of the fire, where they cooked in their own steam inside the wrapping. This was a method with roots deep in Native American cooking, adopted and adapted by both black and white Americans across the continent, and the result, a slightly smoky, slightly dense cornbread with a particular crust from the ash contact, was a food that required nothing but a fire and cornmeal and water and hands. In the first decades of the century, in frontier households and in enslaved communities, where equipment was limited to almost nothing, ash cakes were not a novelty or a curiosity, they were dinner. Salt was essential to all bread in this era, not merely for flavour but for texture and preservation. A bread made without salt would taste flat, yes, but it would also go stale and then mouldy more quickly than a salted loaf. Salt in the dough drew moisture slowly through the crumb in a way that extended the bread's life by a day or two, which mattered in a household where bread was baked once a week and had to remain edible through the following Saturday. The salt used in 1800s American cooking was often coarser than modern table salt. Turk's Island salt or Onondaga salt from upstate New York, or Liverpool salt imported through the major ports. And a cook knew the particular coarseness of the salt she used and adjusted for it by feel rather than by measuring. Measuring was, in fact, only loosely practiced in the 1800s American kitchen. Receipts from the era call for a coffee cup of cornmeal, a wine glass of molasses, a lump of butter the size of an egg, a handful of salt. These were not approximate instructions for a precise method. They were a scaffolding hung over knowledge so deep and so embodied that precise measurement was unnecessary for anyone who already had it. The cook who had been making cornbread every morning for 20 years did not need to measure the cornmeal. She knew the weight of it in the bowl, the sound of it pouring, the way the batter looked when the proportion was right. The receipt was not a recipe in the modern sense. It was a reminder to someone who already knew what they were doing. The smell of bread baking was the smell of sufficiency, and it followed Americans through the century in the way that very few things can follow a society, as both fact and symbol, both daily occurrence and emotional anchor. Women who had grown up in eastern farmhouses and moved to frontier cabins wrote in their letters about the smell of their first bread in a new place, as a marker of home arriving, of the new place beginning to feel survivable. The bread was not just food, it was evidence of continuity. It was proof that the skills had travelled, that the fire worked, that the household had established itself in the new land and was prepared, however modestly, to stay. Pancakes, called flapjacks or griddle cakes or buckwheat cakes depending on the grain used in the region, were the quick morning bread for days when the bread supply had run low or the brick oven was not being heated. Buckwheat was particularly well suited to pancake making because buckwheat flour produced a batter that fermented reliably overnight with just a small addition of sourdough starter, creating a pancake with a slightly sour, deeply earthy flavour and a softness that plain wheat flour did not achieve. The buckwheat pancake batter was a living thing, started the night before in a large crock and left to work through the dark hours, and in the morning it was thick with bubbles and ready to pour onto a hot greased griddle in small rounds that spread slowly and cooked in about 2 minutes on each side. They were stacked and eaten with molasses or maple syrup or simply butter, and they were better than they sound to modern ears, which have not necessarily encountered buckwheat's particular, almost nutty flavour in an unprocessed form. The bread of the 1800s American table was not uniform, and the differences between households in what bread appeared at the daily meal mapped almost exactly onto the differences in wealth, geography and heritage. A New England household of means served yeasted white wheat bread every day. A frontier household in Missouri in 1840 might go weeks eating only cornbread, the wheat flour supply exhausted and the nearest mill too far to visit until the roads dried after spring rains. A German immigrant household in Ohio brought rye bread techniques with them and produced a dark, dense loaf unfamiliar to their neighbours. An African-American household in the Carolinas, whether free or enslaved, might combine African techniques for incorporating fat into bread dough with the available American cornmeal to produce something that was neither African nor American exactly, but something that had come into being in the specific crucible of those two food traditions meeting in that particular place and time. The bread of a nation is never one bread. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. Every American household that could manage it kept a barrel of salt pork, and in most households that could not quite manage it, keeping that barrel was the primary financial aspiration of the year. The barrel was wooden, bound in iron, holding somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of pork packed in brine. Cuts of the pig that had been salted heavily, layered into the barrel with additional salt between each layer, covered in a brine solution of dissolved salt and sometimes sugar or molasses, and left to cure in the cool dark of the cellar or the spring house, or simply the north side of the barn. The barrel smelled of salt and pork fat and something else, something that was the particular smell of meat transforming, not spoiling, or not only spoiling, but changing into something that would keep you alive through the winter months when no fresh meat was available and no animal could be slaughtered without wasting most of it. Pork was the primary meat of 1800s America in a way that is difficult to fully convey to a modern reader. In the early decades of the century, it has been estimated that the average American family consumed between 100 and 200 pounds of pork per year, most of it salt-cured, most of it from the belly, side and jowl of the hog. Beef existed but required pasture that many small farms could not dedicate to it. The milk cow was too valuable to slaughter casually, and beef cattle were expensive to winter over. The pig, by contrast, required almost nothing. It ate what the farm produced as waste. Corn husks, slop from the kitchen, acorns foraged from the woodlot, spoiled produce, and it grew on these contributions into an animal that could be slaughtered in a single day and turned almost entirely into food. Not a pound of the pig was wasted, not even the squeal, the old saying went, and it was not quite a joke. The hog killing happened in late autumn, after the first hard frost but before the deep cold that would make the work unbearable. The timing was deliberate. Cold air slowed the growth of bacteria during the hours between slaughter and preservation, and a warm hog killing was a dangerous one. Neighbours came to help. The labour was heavy, the knives were sharp, and the speed mattered. And the day had a quality that was both practical and social, the kind of working gathering that 1800s rural communities organised around the most demanding tasks. The hog was killed, bled, scalded in a tub of near-boiling water to loosen the bristles, scraped clean, hung from a beam or a stout tree limb to cool overnight, and then butchered the following morning into its parts: hams, shoulders, sides, jowls, feet, head, offal, fat. The fat went into the lard pot first, because lard was as essential as salt in the 1800s kitchen. Cut into small pieces and rendered slowly over low heat, the fat gave up its white liquid grease, which was poured through cloth into crocks and allowed to solidify into a smooth, white, shelf-stable fat that would keep for months in a cool place and serve as the cooking medium for nearly everything: biscuits, cornbread, fried meat, greens, potatoes, pie crust. Good lard had almost no smell when rendered properly. It was clean and neutral, and it fried with a heat tolerance that most modern cooking oils cannot match. Every crock of lard in the cellar represented hours of rendering and straining and careful storing, and every spoonful of it used in the kitchen represented the pig and the autumn and the labour of the hog-killing day working forward into January. The hams and shoulders were the most valuable cuts, worth preserving as carefully as possible, because they would be the source of meat for the most important meals of the winter and spring. They were cured in a dry rub of salt. A large ham might need 15 to 20 pounds of coarse salt worked into it thoroughly, and left in a cold space for several weeks, then washed and hung in the smokehouse. The smokehouse was a small building set apart from the main structures, built of logs or planks with an earth floor and a small fire pit at its centre. Green hardwood, hickory was favoured in the south and midwest, apple and cherry in the north, was burned in that pit for days, filling the building with a cool, heavy smoke that penetrated the meat, dried its surface, and deposited the compounds that would slow bacterial growth and add the particular flavour that Americans came to identify with the word ham. Smoking was not a substitute for salting, but a companion to it. The salt did the primary preservative work. The smoke added a second layer of protection, and contributed the flavour and colour that distinguished smoked ham from salt pork. A ham that had been properly salted and smoked could hang in a cool, dry space for months, some accounts suggest a year or more, and remain edible, though its texture and salinity increased with time in ways that required adjusting its preparation. Old hams needed to soak in water for 12 to 24 hours before cooking to pull out enough salt to make them palatable, and the soaking water was itself useful. The salt pork liquid that remained after cooking was called pot liquor, and it was used to season beans and greens and cornbread, carrying the flavour of the meat through another meal even after the meat itself was gone. Side pork, what we call bacon, was a thinner cut from the belly of the hog, and it cured faster than a ham and smoked faster, and required less cold storage space. It was cut in slabs rather than slices in the original form, and a cook would cut away what she needed for a meal, returning the remainder to the brine or to the hook in the cellar. The flavour of this salt-cured and sometimes smoked side pork was different from modern commercial bacon. Saltier, denser, with a more pronounced pork flavour and less of the sweetness that modern curing methods introduce. And its role in the kitchen extended far beyond the morning meal. Side pork fat was the cooking medium for greens. Side pork went into the bean pot to flavour the beans through 6 hours of simmering. Side pork fried crisp produced the cracklings that were eaten as they were or crumbled into cornbread batter. Nothing about side pork was wasted. The head of the hog produced head cheese, a preparation that most modern eaters would require some preparation to encounter, but which was a straightforward preservation in the 1800s context. The entire head, cleaned, was boiled until the meat fell from the bones, then the meat and soft parts were sorted and chopped fine, seasoned with salt and sage and black pepper, and pressed into a mould where the natural gelatin in the cooking liquid set around it as it cooled. The result was a dense, sliceable loaf of pork that kept well in cold weather and provided meat without requiring any further cooking. It was eaten cold, in slices, with bread or cornbread. and it was regarded not as a curiosity but as a practical solution to the question of what to do with the parts of the animal that did not lend themselves to other preparations. The feet were pickled, cleaned, boiled until tender, packed into crocks with a vinegar and salt brine, and they kept for months in the cellar and were eaten as they were, cold, with their soft gelatinous texture and their deep pork flavour and their coating of spiced vinegar. The ears, the tail, the skin, all of them went somewhere in a system of preservation and use that had been developed over generations of necessity, and that wasted almost nothing. The blood, caught in a bucket at the slaughter, was mixed with cornmeal and fat and spices and cooked into blood pudding. The intestines, cleaned carefully by hand in a long and laborious process, became the casings for sausages. Pork seasoned with sage and salt and black pepper, and sometimes red pepper, ground or chopped fine, packed into the casings and either smoked or allowed to cure dry. Sausage was a preservation technology before it was a meal. The making of sausage required the same rapid, cold-weather timing as the rest of the hog killing. The ground pork spoiled quickly if the kitchen was warm and the packing was delayed, and so sausage making was part of the single long day or two of November labour that turned a live pig into a winter's food supply. Summer sausage, which contained more salt and sometimes saltpetre for preservation and was intended to keep without refrigeration, was a separate preparation from the fresh sausage that went into the morning skillet. The distinction between what needed cold to last and what could last without it was a constant calculation in the 1800s kitchen, as automatic and as essential as breathing. By February, the salt pork barrel in a household that had started autumn well would be somewhere past its peak. The brine had done its work for months, but brine had limits, and the pork at the bottom of the barrel by midwinter had a stronger, more insistent saltiness than the pork from the top in October. It needed longer soaking, stronger seasoning with sage and pepper and whatever herbs had survived drying, more willingness from the people eating it to accept the taste that preservation produced. They did accept it, not cheerfully, always. The late winter longing for fresh meat, for any food that had not spent months in brine, appears in letters and diaries and accounts of the era with a frequency that suggests it was felt keenly, but practically and without drama, because the alternative was not better food. The alternative was no food at all. Wild game supplemented the salt pork through the winter months, in households where a man with a rifle had time and skill to use it. Squirrel and rabbit were the most commonly taken small game, available through most of the winter and requiring no elaborate preparation, parboiled to tenderize, then fried in lard or stewed with onions and whatever vegetables the cellar still held. Venison appeared on tables where deer were plentiful, dressed and hung in the cold for several days to improve its texture before being cooked. Wild turkey was the largest prize, taken in the autumn when the flocks were gathering in oak woodlots, and a large tom turkey fed a family for 2 or 3 meals. Game was not the romantic frontier food of popular imagination. It was practical protein, unpredictable in its availability, and dependent on luck and weather and the hunter's skill in equal measure. But in the weeks when the salt pork barrel was heaviest and the family most tired of its flavour, a stew of fresh rabbit with dried herbs and the last of the root vegetables was something that everyone at the table ate with quiet attention and said very little about while they were eating it. The kitchen garden was the garden nearest the house, and it was not the same thing as the field garden where the main crops grew. The field garden, the corn patch, the bean field, the potato rows, was measured in acres and managed with plough and ox, and the labour of the whole family through the growing months. The kitchen garden was measured in square yards, and was the particular province of the woman of the house, a densely planted, intensively tended plot that sat just outside the kitchen door and contained the ingredients that no American household could cook without: onions and garlic and herbs, summer squash and pumpkins, cabbages and turnips and parsnips, kale and collards, green beans, tomatoes from the mid-century onward, a row of rhubarb for the spring pies. It was small and productive and worked by hand, and the time and attention given to it paid back in flavour and variety, in ways the field garden did not. The herbs that grew in the kitchen garden were not decorative. They were functional in the kitchen and in the medicine chest. These categories were not cleanly separated in the 1800s household, and they were dried and stored with the same care as any other preserved food. Sage hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters and went into sausage and into the stuffing for the Thanksgiving bird and into the pot with salt pork when the salt needed something to argue with. Thyme went into long-cooked soups and stews. Pennyroyal was a fly deterrent and a medicinal herb for digestive complaints. Peppermint was an after-dinner tea and a stomach soother. Chamomile was for sleep, particularly children's sleep, made into a weak tea sweetened with a little honey or molasses and administered warm in the evening. The garden and the medicine cabinet were the same place, tended by the same hands, and the knowledge of which herb served which purpose was a domestic skill as essential as bread baking. Cabbage was one of the most important vegetables in the 1800s American diet, for reasons that go beyond its flavour and straight to its chemistry. Cabbage stored well, a whole head kept for weeks in a cool cellar, and it could be fermented into sauerkraut, which kept for months and provided vitamin C through the winter months when fresh green vegetables were entirely unavailable. The absence of vitamin C through a long winter produced a slow, debilitating condition that was poorly understood in the early 1800s, but was a real presence in communities where the diet was sufficiently limited. The preservation of cabbage was therefore not merely practical but nutritional, though most households would not have used that word. They would have said that sauerkraut kept the family healthy, and they would have been right. Sauerkraut was made in late autumn when the cabbages were harvested, shredded finely with a sharp knife or a wooden cabbage plane, layered in a large crock with salt and pressed down firmly until the salt drew enough liquid from the cabbage to create a brine in which the shredded leaves were submerged. This brine, the cabbage's own liquid pulled out by the salt, was the fermentation medium. The natural bacteria on the cabbage leaves went to work in it over the following weeks, converting the sugars in the cabbage to lactic acid, which was what preserved it. A smooth flat stone or a wooden disc weighted the cabbage down, keeping it below the brine. A cloth tied over the crock kept out dust and flies. The crock sat in a cool corner of the cellar or the springhouse, and the fermentation proceeded without attention through November and into December, and when you lifted the cloth in January the sauerkraut underneath was tart and pungent, and exactly right for a pot of salt pork and the last of the dried beans. The root cellar was the architecture of winter survival, and understanding it is central to understanding 1800s American eating. Built into a hillside or dug below the floor of a barn or a separate outbuilding, lined with stone or packed earth, and accessed through a low door that could be banked with hay bales for additional insulation, the root cellar maintained temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit through winter without any mechanical assistance. This range, cold enough to slow the respiration and decay of vegetables, warm enough not to freeze them solid, was exactly what root vegetables needed to remain edible for months. Carrots and parsnips and turnips and beets were packed in layers of dry sand to prevent them from touching each other, because contact spread rot. Cabbages hung from their roots. Potatoes went in wooden bins, sorted carefully to remove any bruised or damaged tubers before storage, because one bad potato could indeed spoil its neighbours. Onions were braided into long ropes by their dried tops and hung from the cellar rafters, where air could circulate around them. They kept for months this way, and the sight of braided onion ropes hanging in a root cellar was as normal in 1800s America as a bag of onions in a modern refrigerator. Practical and unremarkable, a sight your eye moved past on the way to whatever you came down here to find. Garlic was handled the same way, smaller ropes of it woven together and hung near the onions, and the combined smell of drying alliums in a root cellar had a pungency that was not unpleasant once you were used to it, which most people were from childhood. Pumpkins and winter squash did not go into the root cellar. They needed to be stored slightly warmer and drier than most root vegetables tolerated, and they were typically kept in the loft of the barn or in a cool corner of the kitchen, or in any dry outbuilding where the temperature stayed above freezing. A single large pumpkin could weigh 20 pounds, and a farm household might put away a dozen or more for winter. They were used in pies, boiled and mashed, cut into chunks and cooked in stews, dried in thin slices and strung on thread to preserve them further. Pumpkin pie, which we associate with Thanksgiving, was a year-round food in the 1800s wherever pumpkins could be grown, not a seasonal treat but a regular presence on the table, made from pumpkin that had been boiled and pressed through a sieve, mixed with molasses and eggs and the warming spices, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and baked in a plain lard crust. Pickling extended the reach of the kitchen garden beyond what the root cellar could manage. Cucumbers were the most pickled vegetable, packed in crocks with dill and garlic and a brine of water, vinegar and salt, and allowed to ferment. But pickling was applied to almost any vegetable that was abundant at harvest, and would be missed by February. Pickled beets darkened the brine they sat in to a deep red purple and kept for months in a cool cellar. Pickled green beans, called dilly beans or simply pickled beans, went into quart jars or crocks with vinegar and salt and occasionally a dried red pepper for heat. Corn relish, green tomato pickle, watermelon rind pickle, all of these were made during the abundance of late summer from produce that would otherwise go to waste, and all of them added acid and variety to winter meals that badly needed both. The spring house, a small stone building built over a cool spring or creek, served a function similar to the root cellar but colder and damper, which made it ideal for dairy products and for the temporary storage of fresh produce that the cellar was too warm for in early autumn. Milk crocks sat in the flowing water and stayed cold enough to be safe for a day or two. Fresh churned butter sat in crocks covered with a cloth. The water that flowed through the spring house might be 48 degrees in midsummer, cold enough that your hand went numb in it in a few minutes, and this cold was the pre-refrigeration household's closest equivalent to a refrigerator. A farm with a good spring was a farm with a significant practical advantage, and the location of a farmstead in the 1800s was partly determined by proximity to reliable flowing water. What the kitchen garden and the root cellar and the spring house and the pickle crocks and the dried herbs and the braided onions all shared was the same fundamental quality. They were evidence of labour performed in August and September and October that would not be understood or appreciated until January. The preservation season was a form of work directed entirely at a future that might be dark and cold and difficult, and the motivation for it was so deeply embedded in the habits of every farming household that it rarely required conscious decision. You preserved because winter came. You put things by because the alternative, arriving in November with nothing in the cellar, was not a mistake. It was a catastrophe. In January, you came down the cellar stairs with a candle, and the light moved over the shelves and the bins and the hanging ropes of onions, and you counted what was left and did the calculation that determined how carefully the coming weeks needed to go. The carrots in the sand, the crocks of sauerkraut, the jars of pickled beets ranged on the shelf, the potatoes in their wooden bin, the jug of apple butter near the door. You counted all of it, and the number it added up to told you whether March would be comfortable or thin, and you went back up the stairs into the kitchen with what you needed for tonight's supper, and the cold of the cellar came with you for a moment before the kitchen warmth took over, and you set the vegetables on the table and began. Corn was not simply a grain in 1800s America. It was a civilization, or something that supported a civilization at its most basic level. The relationship between the American farmer and corn in this century was a relationship of mutual dependence so complete that it had restructured the landscape, the fields cleared, the soil worked, the seasons organized around its planting and its harvest. Corn demanded relatively little of the soil compared to wheat, required no threshing machine or specialized equipment beyond a hoe and a plough, stored well in the ear through winter without further processing, yielded food for both the family and the animals on the same plants, and could be processed in more ways than any other single crop. To eat through a day in 1800s, rural America was to eat corn in 4 or 5 different forms before dinner. There were more kinds of corn in the 1800s than most people today have encountered. Field corn, the variety grown for grain rather than for eating fresh, was hard-kerneled, starchy, and intended to be harvested dry and stored dry and either fed to animals or ground into meal. Sweet corn, the kind eaten fresh from the cob, was a separate variety that was grown in smaller quantities near the house and eaten during its brief summer window. Flint corn, harder even than field corn, had multicoloured kernels and was particularly well suited to the colder northeast. Popcorn existed as its own variety. Flour corn, developed partly from Native American cultivation, had a softer starch and was better suited to grinding into flour for fine corn-based baking. The American farmer often grew 2 or 3 varieties, each for its particular purpose, and understood the differences between them with the same precision a modern person might understand the difference between phone models. Hominy was corn transformed by chemistry, and it was one of the most important foods in American cooking that most American food histories underemphasize. The process, called nixtamalization, though this word would not have been used in the 1800s, involved soaking dried corn kernels in a lye solution made from wood ash dissolved in water, which caused the tough outer hull to loosen and slip away and, crucially, changed the nutritional profile of the corn by releasing niacin that was otherwise bound in a form the human body could not absorb. Populations that ate large quantities of corn without this process suffered from pellagra, a severe niacin deficiency that produced skin lesions, digestive problems, and eventually dementia. Populations that learned nixtamalization, which was a Native American invention brought to the Americas diet long before European contact, did not, or did so far less. The chemical knowledge involved was enormous. The practical expression of it required only wood ash, water, and the knowledge that had been passed down through communities for generations. Grits are hominy ground coarsely, and their presence on the American table in the 1800s was both ubiquitous and quietly important in a way that their modern status as a regional specialty does not capture. In the southern states and in the river valleys of the Midwest, grits appeared at breakfast as naturally as cornmeal mush appeared further north. Boiled in water or milk or some combination of both, salted heavily, served with butter or with the pan drippings from the morning's side pork. The texture of properly cooked grits, slow-cooked, low-heat grits, stirred occasionally over 40 minutes rather than the 10-minute quick version, was silky and smooth with a gentle resistance at the centre of each grain, and the flavour of them was the flavour of corn made pure and simple, carrying nothing except what the corn itself offered and what the salt and butter added. Dried beans were the protein of the American interior, and the American interior in the 1800s was most of the country. Before the railway and the refrigerator expanded what was available and how far it could travel, the protein that sustained most rural American households through winter came from two sources, the salt pork barrel and the dried bean bin. Beans, navy beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, black-eyed peas depending on region, and the many varieties that 1800s farming families saved and named over generations, were harvested in summer when the pods dried on the vine, shelled out of their pods into sacks or bins, and stored in the dry dark of the pantry through winter. They weighed very little, stored for years without deteriorating, and when rehydrated and cooked provided calories, protein, and the particular sense of fullness that only legumes produce, a settled heaviness in the body that sustained long hours of physical labour. Beanpot cooking was an art with its own slow rhythm. Dried beans were soaked overnight, 12 to 16 hours in cold water, which softened the outer skin and began the rehydration that would continue in the pot, then drained and covered in fresh cold water with a piece of salt pork, a chopped onion, perhaps a dried red pepper for warmth, and set over the lowest possible fire for 6 to 8 hours. The low heat was essential. Beans cooked at a boil turned to mush, their skin splitting, their texture going from firm and separate to loose and featureless. Beans cooked at a bare simmer, the liquid moving slowly at the surface, barely breaking, sending up occasional small bubbles rather than a steady roll, held their shape and developed a creaminess at their centre that was entirely different from the chalky grain of an underdone bean. The patience required was real, and the rewards were proportional to it. Baked beans were the Saturday food throughout New England and spreading westward with the Yankee diaspora, and their origins lay in the combination of the bean pot with the weekly bread baking. On Saturday morning, when the brick oven was heated for the week's bread, the bean pot went in alongside it and stayed through the afternoon and evening, and sometimes through the night, cooking slowly in the declining heat of the oven after the bread had been removed. Baked beans required molasses, the dark, thick sweetener that was the primary sweetener in most American households through the middle of the century, and a piece of salt pork and an onion, and the long heat that concentrated all of it into something with a sweetness and depth and colour quite different from boiled beans. They were eaten on Saturday, and the leftovers were eaten for breakfast on Sunday morning, cold from the cellar, spread on bread, and they were better cold than they had been hot, which is something that beans have always known and people have always discovered. The potato arrived late to the American table by the standards of European history. It was only in the 1840s and 1850s, with the great wave of Irish immigration following the famine years, that the potato became a staple crop across much of the northern United States. But it adapted to American farming with a speed and thoroughness that suggested the land had been waiting for it. Potatoes could be grown in soil too rocky or thin for grain crops. They produced more calories per acre than wheat. They kept well through winter in the root cellar, losing only a little of their starchiness as the months passed. And they were versatile in ways that only the onion could rival in the 1800s kitchen. Boiled, mashed, fried in lard, baked in the oven, roasted in the coals, added to soups and stews to thicken them with their natural starch, dried in thin slices for longer storage. Mashed potatoes, boiled until completely soft, drained, mashed with a heavy fork or a wooden masher, worked smooth with a knob of butter and a pour of hot milk and salt, were the comfort food of the 1800s American household in a way that any modern person would recognize immediately, because the pleasure of mashed potatoes is the kind of pleasure that does not require historical context to appreciate. It is the pleasure of soft starch and fat and salt working together against the background of hunger after a long cold day, and it is the same pleasure in 1855 as it is now, produced by the same chemistry, in the same body, with the same result, a settling, a warmth that begins in the stomach and moves outward. Turnips were less beloved but more reliable than almost anything else in the winter vegetable cellar. They grew in poor soil, stored extremely well, and provided a sweetness that deepened with frost, a truth known to farmers that the science of sugar chemistry would later explain, though the farmers did not need the explanation to know it was true. Turnips boiled soft and mashed with butter and salt were a different food from raw turnips, milder and sweeter, and substantially less challenging to the palate. Cooked with salt pork into a simple stew, they absorbed the pork fat and the salt, and became something warm and filling that asked nothing of the cook, beyond time and a fire. They were not aspired to, they were depended upon, which is a different kind of importance. What came up from the ground in 1800s America was not always what people wanted to eat. It was what the soil and the season and the labour and the weather had produced, and you ate it in the form it was available in. Fresh in August, preserved by November, dwindling and slightly tired by March. The sophistication that is possible with a modern pantry, where summer produce and winter produce and produce from distant climates coexist on the same shelf in the same week. This sophistication was not available to the 1800s household, and its absence required a different relationship with food, one organised around patience and planning, and a realistic understanding of what the earth offers in cycles rather than in constant supply. The earth, it turned out, offered quite a lot, even within those limits. You just had to learn how to count it. If you are drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. White sugar in the early 1800s was a luxury that most American households used sparingly. A small conical loaf of refined cane sugar wrapped in blue paper, bought at the general store for a price that made it something to be measured out carefully with a special implement called a sugar nip, and used only where its whiteness and clarity of flavour mattered. It was for the good cake at Christmas, for the tea served to important company, for the occasional special sweetening of something that molasses could not do as well. For most daily sweetening, most American households in the first half of the century reached for something else entirely, and that something was molasses, thick, dark, sweet, with a complexity of flavour that white sugar specifically lacked. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar refining, the dark liquid drained off during the process of crystallizing white sugar from sugarcane juice. It came in grades, like molasses from the first extraction, darker and stronger from subsequent extractions, and blackstrap molasses from the final extraction, which was so dark and bitter and mineral forward that it required adjustment to eat with pleasure, but was also the cheapest and most nutritionally dense of the three. American households used all three grades for different purposes, with lighter molasses for gingerbread and baking, and darker molasses for the bean pot and the barbecue sauce and the ginger cookies, and wherever a deep, slightly bitter sweetness was appropriate. Molasses went into almost everything sweet in the 1800s American kitchen, and its flavour, warm, dark, complicated, with a slight edge that balanced its sweetness, is the flavour of an entire century of American baking. Gingerbread was the molasses food most universal in the American table, made in the northeast and the south and on the frontier, in prosperous houses and in modest ones, carried to church socials and baked for children, and pressed into wooden moulds for the holidays. The molasses gingerbread of the 1800s, not the dry crumbly cookie of later eras, but the soft, dark, moist cake made with lard and molasses and beaten eggs and ginger, and sometimes cinnamon and cloves, required no white sugar and no expensive flavourings beyond the spices, which were themselves a significant purchase, but lasted for months and perfumed the pantry shelf where they sat in small paper packets. A good gingerbread was a cake that improved over a day or two. the flavours deepening and the texture becoming more resilient, and the ginger's heat mellowing into something that was warmth rather than sharpness. Maple syrup and maple sugar were the sweeteners of the northern forest states and of New England and the Great Lakes frontier, produced in the weeks of early spring when the conditions were right: cold nights, warm days, temperatures that caused the sap to flow through the sugar maple in a pressure-driven cycle that tapping revealed. The sugar camp was a seasonal establishment, a collection of iron kettles hung over outdoor fires in the maple grove, tended for days at a stretch while the sap boiled down from its thin, barely sweet raw state into the amber concentration of syrup and eventually into the dry crystalline maple sugar that was the pre-railroad sweetener of choice in the northern states. Maple sugar kept without refrigeration could be pressed into moulds that gave it a flat cake form convenient for storage and dissolved readily into baking or beverages. It tasted of the trees and the cold and the particular spring of that year, and families who made it every March had opinions about the particular flavour of their own grove's sap that people in the modern era reserve for wine. Sorghum syrup was the sweetener of the South and the Midwest from around mid-century onward, produced from the juice of the sorghum cane, a tall grass related distantly to corn that could be grown in poorer soils and with less rainfall than sugar cane. Sorghum juice was extracted by running the stalks through a mule-powered press, then boiled in long, shallow pans until it reached the consistency of syrup, thinner than molasses, lighter in colour, with a particular grassy sweetness that was distinctly its own, and became the dominant flavour of the southern table in the years after the Civil War, when cane molasses became expensive and difficult to obtain in the interior. Sorghum syrup over hot biscuits, sorghum in the bean pot. Sorghum stirred into the morning's cornmeal mush. It was the sweetener of modest households and farm kitchens throughout the second half of the century. Honey was the oldest sweetener in the American household, available wherever a family kept bees or wherever wild bees could be found and their hives robbed in the autumn. The keeping of bees, in wooden boxes or in log gums, the hollow log sections that made the most primitive hive form, was a common small skill in the 1800s farm household, producing beeswax for candles and polishing and waterproofing as well as honey for sweetening. Different flowers produced different honeys. Clover honey was light and mild. Buckwheat honey, common in the northeast, was dark and nearly as strong as molasses. Wildflower honey varied by what was blooming when the bees were most active and could be anything from delicate to powerfully flavoured. Honey in the comb, the wax cells of the honeycomb still intact, the honey sealed inside them, was considered a delicacy and was brought out for company or for special mornings, spread directly on bread and eaten with the wax, which was chewed and eventually discarded. Pies occupied a special position in the 1800s American diet that has no precise modern equivalent, because pies were not primarily dessert. They were calorie delivery systems, portable and storable, and made from whatever was at hand and eaten at any meal including breakfast. Pie for breakfast was not unusual in rural American households through much of the century. A slice of apple pie or pumpkin pie or dried fruit pie alongside the morning's cornmeal mush was a meal that provided starch and fat and sweetness at the start of a day that would require significant physical labour. The pie crust itself, lard worked into flour with cold water and salt, was a substantial source of calories in a way that modern pie crust, made with butter and less lard, is not quite, because lard makes a more cohesive, denser crust than butter, and it made it in quantities that sustained working bodies. Apple butter was the preserve that appeared most widely in the autumn record of the 1800s American household, a product of the apple harvest concentrated down to something spreadable and shelf-stable by long, slow cooking. Apples were peeled and cored and cooked in cider, fresh-pressed apple juice, which would itself begin fermenting into hard cider within days if left at room temperature, with sugar or molasses and cinnamon and cloves and whatever spices the household had on hand, then stirred continuously in a large copper or iron kettle over an outdoor fire for 6 to 8 hours, while the cider evaporated and the apple pulp darkened and concentrated and thickened into a spread the colour of dark mahogany. Apple butter making was a community event in some regions, with neighbours gathering for the all-day stirring and the evening meal that followed, and the apple butter that went into crocks at the end of the day carried the flavour of the autumn, and the company with it into the winter months. Preserves and jams were the summer's plenty stored in glass, and the making of them through July and August was a hot, sticky labour performed on the hottest days, next to a fire that had to burn hot to bring the fruit and sugar to the rolling boil that sterilised the mixture and drove off enough water to create the thick set that would preserve the fruit. Strawberry preserves, blackberry jam, grape jelly strained through cloth bags to make it clear, peach preserves with the fruit cut in slices and barely cooked, so it held its shape in a thick syrup, currant jelly, tart and brilliant red, eaten with meat as a condiment rather than on bread. The jars went into the cellar on the shelf beside the pickles, and they constituted a kind of wealth that was measured in quarts rather than dollars, and the full shelf in September was a specific kind of security that people who have never needed it perhaps cannot fully imagine. Pie crust was made without measurements, and good pie crust was a point of domestic pride in the 1800s American household in a way that is hard to overstate. A woman known in her community for fine pie crust had a specific reputation, distinct from being known as a good cook generally, and the compliment was not trivial. The technique required cold fat, worked quickly, with minimal handling. The warmth of too many touches toughened the gluten, melted the lard pieces that created flakiness, produced a crust that was strong rather than tender. You felt it through the motion of your fingers, the moment when the fat and flour reached the right state of integration, and you stopped before you went past that moment, and you added the cold water just until the dough held, and you let it rest in the cool before rolling, and the rolling itself was a single patient motion, not pressed down but rolled out, the pin moving away from you and back without the rotating and lifting that would develop the gluten. The crust that resulted was a separate food from the filling it held. It was worth eating on its own. Vinegar pie was a recipe that appeared in American cookbooks and household receipts throughout the middle of the century, and that tells a particular story about what happened when the pantry was nearly bare, and a pie was nonetheless needed. Made from eggs and sugar and butter and vinegar, cider vinegar, which every farm household produced in quantity, as hard cider continued its fermentation past the drinking stage. It produced a custard filling that was tangy and sweet, in a proportion determined by how much sugar you had and how much vinegar your eggs and butter could support. Mock apple pie, made from crackers soaked in water with cinnamon and sugar and a splash of vinegar to approximate the acid of apples, appeared in frontier households, and in the Civil War years when apples were scarce, and the recipe for what absence tasted like when sugar and imagination were applied to it was passed between women the way all knowledge of necessity moves, quietly, through proximity, without being called resourcefulness, because resourcefulness was simply what cooking was. The sugar economy that supplied the American sweet tooth through most of this century was built on slavery, in ways that the consumption of molasses and refined cane sugar made unavoidable to acknowledge, though the connection was rarely made explicit at the table where these sweeteners appeared. Louisiana cane sugar and Caribbean molasses moved north and west through American markets, and the price of sweetness in an 1800s American kitchen was set partly by the labour of enslaved people on sugar plantations, whose existence made the sweetener possible, and whose stories rarely appeared in the receipts that called for their product. This is a history that the molasses jug sitting on the pantry shelf carried without announcing, and it is worth knowing that it was there. The milk cow was among the most valuable animals on the 1800s farm, and her value was not primarily measured in what she would be worth at slaughter, because slaughtering a good milk cow was an economic mistake of considerable magnitude. Her value was daily and ongoing, in the milk she produced each morning and evening, in the cream that rose from that milk when it was left to sit undisturbed, in the butter churned from that cream, in the buttermilk that remained after churning, in the clabbered milk that soured naturally in warm weather and provided leavening and flavour to a dozen different preparations. The milk cow was a small dairy in herself, and the management of her product, the timing of milking, the cooling of the milk, the skimming of the cream, the churning of the butter, was a daily labour as regular and as essential as tending the fire. Milking happened twice a day, at the same hours, because cows are creatures of habit, and their milk production responds to routine in ways that were practically understood long before they were scientifically explained. The morning milking began before breakfast and required going out to the barn in whatever the weather was, in January darkness or July heat, with a wooden bucket and a stool, and the knowledge of each individual cow's particular temperament. Some cows were easy, and some were difficult, and some were easy in summer and difficult in winter, and some had a specific distrust of strangers and a specific tolerance of the person who milked them every morning for years, The relationship between the milkmaid or the farm wife and the milk cow was a relationship of familiarity, refined to something that resembled, at the surface, affection. The fresh milk was strained through a clean cloth to remove hay and barn debris, then poured into wide, shallow pans, pottery crocks or tinned iron pans, and carried to the spring house to cool. Set in the flowing spring water, the pans of milk would cool quickly, and as they cooled, the cream, lighter and fattier than the milk below it, would rise slowly to the surface over the following 12 to 24 hours, forming a visible layer that could be skimmed off with a flat spoon or a shallow ladle. This cream was the material of butter, and skimming it was one of the small daily rituals of the dairy that required patience rather than skill. You disturbed the cream as little as possible in the skimming, moving the ladle slowly across the surface and lifting rather than scooping, and the cream that came up was thicker and richer for the care you took with it. Cream accumulated in a separate crock until there was enough for a churning, several quarts at minimum, and a serious churning used considerably more. The cream for butter needed to be at a specific temperature to churn properly. Too cold, and the butter would take an exhaustingly long time to form, the fat molecules too sluggish in the cold to coalesce. Too warm, and the resulting butter would be soft and poorly textured, and might not hold together at all. The experienced dairymaid knew the right temperature by holding her hand against the outside of the churn and feeling for a quality that she would have described as cool but not cold, something near 55 degrees Fahrenheit, though the thermometer was not the tool she used to find it. The churn was a wooden vessel, upright, like a tall bucket, with a lid fitted with a central hole through which a dasher passed, a long stick with a cross-shaped paddle at the bottom. You pushed the dasher up and down, in a steady rhythm that forced the cream up and down against itself, and gradually, over 20 minutes to an hour depending on the temperature and the fat content of the cream, caused the fat globules in the cream to break their protective membranes and clump together into larger and larger masses of butter. The moment of butter coming was recognizable by sound and feel before it was visible. The rhythm of the dasher changed. The resistance in the churn became different, heavier in a specific way, and if you lifted the lid you would see the cream no longer filling the churn smoothly, but beginning to separate into yellow clumps floating in a thin bluish-white liquid. That liquid, the buttermilk remaining after the fat had been removed, was not waste. It was an ingredient of great usefulness in the 1800s kitchen, used for its acidity in baking cornbread and biscuits and pancakes, drunk as a beverage by people who found its thin sourness refreshing in summer, fed to the pigs as part of the continuous recycling of food processing byproducts that characterized the 1800s farm. Buttermilk had a particular tangy quality, different from fresh milk and different from soured milk, and its acidity made it the ideal liquid for activating baking soda in the new quick bread recipes of the mid-century, a property that cornmeal batter bakers learned quickly and came to rely on. The butter itself was worked, gathered from the buttermilk with a wooden paddle, rinsed in cold water to remove the last of the buttermilk, which would cause it to go rancid faster if left in, and then worked with the paddle against a wooden bowl to squeeze out further liquid and incorporate salt. Salted butter kept longer than unsalted, and keeping was the primary consideration. In summer, butter made without sufficient salt would begin to go off in a matter of days, producing the sour, slightly rancid flavour that became familiar enough in the 1800s to be accepted as normal in weather that made preservation difficult. In winter, the cold preserved butter without salt, and some households kept their winter butter unsalted specifically for the cleaner flavour, reserving the salted version for summer and for the crocks of packed butter that were stored for months. Packed butter was a preservation method for surplus, the excess of the summer months when cows were giving their most milk, put up against the winter months when milk production dropped and fresh butter was scarce. The butter was worked salt into it heavily, packed into stoneware crocks, and sealed with a layer of brine or additional salt at the top to keep out air. This butter, retrieved from the crock in January, tasted strongly of salt, and had a texture somewhat different from fresh butter, firmer with a slight granularity from the salt crystals. But it was butter, and butter in January was a luxury even on farms that had produced it abundantly in July. Cheese was made from milk as well, though not all farm households made it regularly. It required more equipment and more consistent attention than butter making, and the results were more variable and more dependent on the particular bacteria in the environment of the dairy, which changed from farm to farm and season to season, in ways that produced dramatic variation in the flavour and quality of the final product. The most common farmhouse cheese was a simple fresh cheese, milk curdled with rennet or vinegar, or the stomach of a young calf, the curds pressed in a cloth, salted and eaten fresh or allowed to age briefly. More serious cheddar-style cheeses required a press and weeks of careful aging, and the households that produced them consistently and well had developed, over years of iteration, an understanding of their own dairy's bacteria that amounted to a cultivated relationship with the invisible. Clabber, milk allowed to sour naturally until it thickened to a soft yogurt-like consistency, was a common food in the 1800s American household, particularly in summer when milk soured quickly and the choice was between eating it clabbered or losing it entirely. Clabber was eaten with sugar or molasses, sometimes with a little cream poured over it, sometimes with cornbread crumbled into it, and while it required no preparation beyond patience, it occupied the same general category of simple, practical, dairy-sourced food as buttermilk and fresh cheese, foods that existed because of the dairy's generosity and would be eaten in whatever form they offered themselves. The sourness of clabber was not a defect. It was the flavour of milk becoming something else, something that the body in the heat of an 1800s summer recognised as cool and nourishing and slightly restorative in ways that fresh milk in the same heat could not quite be. The dairy, taken together, the cow and her daily gift, the cream and its rising, the churn and its labour, the butter and its keeping, the buttermilk and the clabber and the cheese and the sour milk that went into the bread, was a system of food production that required daily attention and produced daily reward, and it was managed almost entirely by women. The dairy was not supplementary to the 1800s household. It was one of its foundations, and the knowledge required to manage it well was technical and specific, and earned through years of standing at someone else's side and learning from the colour of the cream, and the feel of the churn, and the smell of the butter that told you whether the work was going right or whether something needed to change. What is less often said about the 1800s dairy is the social dimension of butter and cheese as tradable goods. A woman who produced more butter than her household consumed could sell the surplus at the general store or to a neighbour, and this transaction, the sale of surplus dairy, was one of the few avenues through which women in the 1800s American household generated independent income. The egg money and the butter money were categories recognised in household accounts of the era. Small streams of cash that women managed and spent on the household goods that required cash purchase, thread, needles, spices, fabric, and that represented a degree of economic agency embedded inside the domestic economy that looked from outside the household like simply cooking, and was from inside it something more than that. Cream in summer was a problem as well as a gift. The warm months that made the cows give most generously were also the months that made cream go off fastest, the natural bacteria in it multiplying in the heat, with the same enthusiasm as the bacteria in any other perishable food left in a warm room. A household without a spring house or a good cold cellar would find that the morning's cream had begun to turn by afternoon, and the question then was not whether to throw it away. Throwing food away was almost never an option, but what to use it for. Slightly soured cream could go into the cornbread batter or the biscuit dough, where its acidity served the same leavening function as buttermilk. More soured than that, and it might still go into a pie that was to be eaten the same day. The cook's judgment about when something had moved from ripe to spoiled was a judgment she made every day and trusted without being conscious of trusting it. Winter in the 1800s, American household was not a season of hardship in the dramatic sense. It was not, for most families who had managed the autumn's work adequately, a season of going hungry. It was a season of sameness. The root cellar held its supply of turnips and carrots and potatoes and cabbages. The salt pork barrel held its supply of cured meat. The dried bean bin held beans. The cornmeal sack held meal. The pickles and preserves and apple butter and sauerkraut sat on the cellar shelf in their crocks and jars. There was enough, and the enough was monotonous, and the monotony of winter eating. The same rotation of cornmeal mush and salt pork and dried beans and pickled cabbage, appearing in slightly different arrangements across the weeks, was one of the fundamental facts of 1800s American domestic life that most historical accounts mention and move past too quickly. The monotony was not universal. Prosperous households had more variety, better access to stored goods from the previous summer, more money to purchase imported staples from the general store in town, dried fruits, spices, white sugar, perhaps tinned fish from coastal sources. Households near rivers or the coast could sometimes obtain fresh fish through winter. Hunters brought in wild game when the weather permitted, rabbit and squirrel most commonly, deer less predictably, wild turkey in certain regions. But for the ordinary rural household of the early to middle 1800s, the winter table was a table of limited choices, and the skill of the cook was expressed in making those limited choices feel different from each other, which required seasoning and technique, and an understanding of how the same ingredients could be rendered in ways that the body experienced as variety even when the pantry offered very little of it. The first sign of spring coming, in the food sense, was the appearance of maple sugar season in the northern states, which arrived in late February or March when the temperatures began their daily swings between freezing nights and thawing days, and the sap stirred in the maples. This was the sugar camp month, when families who owned sugar maples or had access to a woodlot with them set out their taps and their buckets, and began the boiling down labour that produced the year's sweetener. The sap itself, drunk fresh, was a thin, barely sweet water that tasted of the cold earth releasing its held energy, and people drank it as it ran because after months of preserved foods and dried foods and salted foods, the clean, living quality of fresh sap was remarkable. It was the first fresh thing of the year, spring proper, which arrived gradually and unreliably in most of the country, with cold days pushing back against warm ones through April, brought the first edible wild plants weeks before the kitchen garden produced anything. Ramps emerged from the leaf litter of woodland floors, their broad dark green leaves pushing through before the trees leafed out, their flavour a powerful combination of garlic and onion that was overwhelming to anyone encountering it fresh in winter-softened form. Dandelion greens, which modern eaters sometimes encounter as a deliberate salad choice, were harvested from fields and lawns in the early spring with urgency, because the young leaves before the flower formed were far less bitter than the mature plant, and they represented fresh greens after months without them. Watercress grew along cool streams through spring. Fiddlehead ferns uncurled from the forest floor in a brief window of days, after which they became too tough and too strongly flavoured to eat pleasurably. These spring greens were not eaten with subtlety in most 1800s kitchens. They were wilted in a pan with salt pork fat, the same fat that appeared in every other preparation, the fat that was the kitchen's primary cooking medium, and eaten with the pot liquor that collected in the pan, and they were eaten quickly and in large quantities while they lasted. The body's response to fresh greens after a winter of preserved food was a response that could be read in the face of the person eating them, a kind of loosening, a quality of relief that went beyond the simple pleasure of food and into something more physiological. The vitamin and mineral content of fresh greens against the background of a winter diet that contained very little of either was the body recognizing what it had been missing, and it recognized it through appetite. The greens disappeared fast, and the second mess of them from the garden a week later disappeared equally fast, and by the time summer arrived and greens were ordinary again, you had stopped noticing them. Summer was abundance, and abundance in the 1800s had a flavour of pressure underneath it. The kitchen garden came in quickly once the heat settled. Beans and squash and cucumbers and tomatoes and corn and more greens than you could eat fresh. And the kitchen work of summer was not just cooking what was available now, but preserving what was available now for what would be needed later. Fresh tomatoes for the table in July meant tomatoes put up in crocks for the winter stews of January. Fresh cucumbers became pickles. Green beans that could not be eaten fresh were strung on thread and dried. Leather breeches they were called in the Appalachian tradition, or pickled. The peas that came in all at once in June needed to be shelled and dried quickly before they fermented in the pod. Summer was the season of eating well and working constantly, and the two things happened simultaneously, and the work was in service of the future. The summer meals themselves at their best had a quality that winter cooking could not produce: freshness and variety, and the particular sweetness of vegetables eaten within hours of harvesting. A supper of boiled green corn on the cob, pulled from the garden that afternoon, husked and dropped into a pot of boiling water, and eaten with butter and salt, was a meal that required almost no cooking skill, and produced a pleasure almost wordlessly good. The corn's sweetness in the 1800s was different from modern sweet corn varieties, which have been bred for higher sugar content and slower conversion of sugar to starch. The old varieties were sweeter earlier and starchier later, and the window for eating them at their best was a matter of days, which meant that corn time was a season within a season, and the household organised itself around it. Autumn was the most complex season at the American table and the most demanding. The harvest months, September and October in most of the country, required the farm household to be simultaneously processing, preserving, and storing, while also managing the daily meals that needed to be cooked regardless of what else was happening. The apple harvest produced its own occupations: cider pressing, apple butter making, the slicing and drying of apple rings on strings in the sun. The potato harvest required digging, sorting, and careful cellar storage. The cabbage needed to be made into sauerkraut. The corn needed to be harvested and husked and stored. The beans needed to be dried. The pumpkins and squash needed to be moved before the first frost killed them. The hog needed to be watched, fattened for the November slaughter. All of this happened in the same 6 weeks. The particular autumn food that punctuated all this work was cider, fresh-pressed apple cider, running sweet and slightly murky from the press, tasting of everything the apple trees had been doing since June. Cider was the autumn beverage in apple country, which was most of the northeast and the upper Midwest, and considerable stretches of the south where apple cultivation had been established. Fresh cider kept for a week or two before it began to ferment. Fermenting cider became hard cider, which kept for months and was the table drink through winter. Hard cider, fully fermented and left to age, became something between a very dry wine and a beer, with an alcohol content that varied widely depending on the sweetness of the original apples and the length of fermentation. In a household where water was not reliably safe and whiskey was used for everything from warming the stomach to numbing the pain of a toothache, hard cider was simply what you drank. The Thanksgiving meal, which did not become a national holiday until Lincoln's proclamation in 1863 but existed as a regional New England tradition well before that, was the autumn table at its most deliberate and its most particular. A roasted bird, turkey, where they could be had, or a chicken or a goose where they could not. Mashed potatoes made from the new potatoes still fresh from the autumn digging. Turnips and parsnips. Cranberry sauce made from the wild or cultivated cranberries of the boglands of New England and the Great Lakes, cooked with sugar into a tart jelly that provided the acid note the table needed against the richness of the roasted bird and the fatness of the gravy. Apple pie and pumpkin pie. Mince pie made from cooked and spiced meat mixed with dried fruits and brandy or cider, which was a preservation in its own right and which could be made weeks in advance and stored in the cold until needed. The food year in 1800s America, considered from beginning to end, was a cycle of scarcity and abundance, and the labour required to convert one into the other. Winter scarcity generated the pressure of spring's preservation work. Spring's first greens generated relief. Summer's abundance generated the work of putting things by. Autumn's harvest generated its own controlled urgency. And then winter again, with the cellar provisioned, the salt pork barrel full, the bean bin stocked, and the table set for the long months of patience that the season required. It was not a romantic cycle from inside it. It was demanding and repetitive, and the rewards were sometimes thin, but it was also deeply comprehensible. A life organised around a pattern that made sense, in which the effort of one season directly supported the survival of the next, and the relationship between work and eating was clear and unambiguous, and never far from anyone's awareness. The arrival of company announced itself to the kitchen before it announced itself to the front room, because company meant food different from what the household ate on ordinary days, and preparing that food took time that needed to begin before the company arrived. The woman of the house who had been told that her sister's family was coming for Sunday dinner, or that the minister and his wife had accepted an invitation, began the calculation not at breakfast on Sunday morning, but at breakfast on Friday. Was there a chicken that could be spared from the yard? Was there flour enough for a proper cake? Were the better dishes clean and in the cupboard? Was the tablecloth without stains that could not be hidden? Company dining in the 1800s American household was a social obligation that carried the weight of the household's reputation, and the table set for company communicated things about the family that everyone present understood and no one said directly. Chicken was the company meat of the 1800s American household, in a way that is almost exactly reversed from its modern status as the most ordinary and affordable of meats. In the 1800s, beef and pork were the everyday proteins. Beef where cattle were available, pork everywhere. Chicken was reserved for guests because a chicken was a living animal that was also laying eggs, and to kill a laying hen for a meal was to sacrifice future eggs, as well as the immediate bird, which was a real economic decision. A roasted chicken, or a fried chicken, or a chicken fricassee slow-cooked in cream and thickened with flour, communicated to company that they were valued enough to warrant that sacrifice, and the company understood this message in the way that people understand the economic language of hospitality, even when it is never spoken. Fried chicken, now considered quintessentially southern, but practiced across the country with regional variations, was a company preparation because it required a quantity of hot lard deep enough to submerge or nearly submerge the pieces, and heating that much fat to frying temperature required planning and commitment, and a fire management skill different from the daily cooking. The chicken was cut into pieces, seasoned with salt and pepper, dredged in flour or rolled in cornmeal depending on region and preference, and lowered carefully into the hot fat where it sizzled with a sound that was satisfying in a very particular way, the confident, steady sound of something going right. The pieces were turned once, sometimes twice, and lifted when the coating was golden and the juices at the joint of leg and thigh ran clear. The fat was then often used to make a gravy, flour stirred into the drippings and milk or cream added and stirred over heat until it thickened to a creamy sauce. The Sunday table, whether or not company was present, was distinguished from the weekday table in most 1800s households by the quality of the bread. The wheat bread that had been baked on Saturday was brought out for Sunday, white or close to it, cut in thick slices and placed on the table beside the regular butter rather than the working day cornbread. This substitution was not simply gustatory, it was social. The white bread on Sunday was part of a larger set of Sunday practices: the better clothes, the suspended labour, the church attendance if the family were church-going. That marked the day as different from the ordinary week. Food participated in the marking of time and occasion in ways that went beyond nutrition, and the families who performed these Sunday distinctions were performing a kind of punctuation in their lives, separating the weekly sections from each other with a ritual that gave the passing time some shape. Church socials and community dinners were the occasions when the competitive generosity of 1800s American cooking became most visible. Every woman in attendance brought a dish to contribute to the communal table, and every dish was set out together, and the entire community ate together, and the quality of what each household contributed was understood by every person, present and discussed afterward, with a particular mixture of charity and frankness that communities reserve for the things they genuinely care about. A woman known for her layer cake, another known for her chicken and dumplings, the minister's wife whose potato salad appeared at every outdoor occasion and was considered definitive. These were not trivial reputations. They were a form of social standing in a community where cooking skill was among the most visible expressions of domestic competence. Cake, a real cake, made with white flour and white sugar and eggs and butter, sometimes with flavouring of vanilla or lemon or nutmeg, sometimes with a frosting of boiled sugar, sometimes layer upon layer, was not the ordinary food of the 1800s American household. It was the special occasion food, made for birthdays and weddings and Christmas and the church social, and the labour of it was real, because cake required fresh ingredients that cost money and techniques that required practice. The beating of butter and sugar together until light and fluffy, a process that took 15 minutes of sustained effort with a wooden spoon before the invention of the rotary egg beater in the 1860s, was the beginning of a cake that would take the better part of an afternoon to complete and bake and cool. When a woman brought a layer cake to a community dinner, she had brought 3 or 4 hours of her day, and everyone who ate it knew it. Wedding cakes in the 1800s were a particular form of ambition, sometimes rising to several tiers made with the finest white flour, dried fruits, spiced with nutmeg, and cinnamon and cloves, moistened with brandy or bourbon for preservation, frosted in a white sugar icing that required its own lengthy preparation. The tradition of saving the top tier for the first anniversary was already present in this century, and it made practical sense in the era before refrigeration, because a well-made fruitcake, soaked regularly in spirits, could be kept for a year. The amount of alcohol involved was substantial, and the preservation it provided was genuine, and this was a wedding cake that tasted of the whole ceremony and the passage of time when it was finally retrieved and eaten 12 months later. Holiday food in the 1800s. American household organised itself around what the season and the region offered, rather than around fixed menus that arrived from commercial culture. Christmas in New England meant a roasted goose, or a chicken, mince pies, gingerbread, perhaps an orange. An orange, transported from the south, was an exotic and expensive gift for a child in the 1800s North, appearing in stockings as the most foreign and extraordinary thing the household contained. Christmas in the South might centre around a whole hog roasted outdoors over a long pit fire, with sweet potato pie and sorghum cookies, and eggnog made from raw eggs beaten with cream and whiskey, or in more temperate households without the whiskey, which the temperance movement had begun to render complicated by mid-century. The harvest supper, held in the barn after the last of the field corn was brought in the version that involved the community, or quietly at the kitchen table in the version that was just family, was the meal with the largest possible shadow behind it. The work of the season was done. The grain was in the barn. The root cellar was full. The salt pork barrel was sealed. The mush pot for tomorrow morning was already set out. The meal itself, whatever it contained, and it was usually whatever the season had provided most abundantly, which in October meant corn in several forms and roasted squash and the last fresh apples and whatever meat could be prepared, tasted of completion rather than simply of food, and the people eating it knew this without articulating it, and the knowing was something that moved through the table quietly. What company meals and Sunday tables and church socials and holiday dinners all shared was the function of distinguishing time. The food was different from the ordinary food not merely because of cost or labour, but because the difference itself was meaningful. To eat the same food every day and then eat something different and better, the roasted chicken, the layer cake, the white bread, the mince pie, was to feel the distinction between the ordinary and the occasion in a bodily way, and this distinction gave the calendar its texture. Without the company supper, Sunday would dissolve into Wednesday. Without the harvest dinner, October would fade into November unmarked. The special food was the marker, and the marking was as important as the food itself. In the morning after a company dinner, the house was quieter in a specific way. The dishes were washed or stacked waiting. The tablecloth needed laundering. The remnants of last night's roasted chicken were wrapped in a cloth in the cellar. The cake plate held a dusting of crumbs. The fire needed the same attention it needed every morning, and you gave it the same attention, and the day returned to its ordinary self with the ease of water resuming its level. But the supper had happened, and it was inside the people who had eaten it, and it moved with them into the ordinary week in the way that good food always moves. Not as memory exactly, not as physical sensation anymore, but as something warmer than either, something settled in the middle of the body that says simply that you were here, and it was good, and it was enough. The potluck dinner, which in its 1800s form was less a planned event with assigned dishes than an improvisational community gathering, where every household contributed whatever was at hand, was the most democratic expression of the community table. The name itself came from the phrase luck of the pot. What you got when you arrived at someone's table depended on the luck of what was in the pot that day, and the expectation was not that the meal would be particular, but that it would be generous, and that the gathering itself was the point. People who have grown up attending potluck events in church basements or community halls are participating in something very old, much older than the church basements themselves, and the 1800s version of it happened outdoors more often than in the shade of a large tree, or in the barn cleared of its summer hay, with tables improvised from boards and sawhorses and food laid out with no ceremony except the pleasure of seeing what everyone had brought. Leftovers in the 1800s household were not a lower category of food. They were an extension of the original meal, often improved by a day in the root cellar or the spring house, and the cook who knew how to use what the previous meal had left behind was practicing a skill as real as any that went into the original preparation. Cold roasted chicken pulled from the bone and mixed with vinegar dressing, and whatever vegetables the season offered was a salad. Last night's beans warmed with a little water, and a new piece of salt pork and a handful of dried herbs from the ceiling were a different thing than they had been the night before, with a depth of flavour that only reheated beans achieve. Bread gone stale was soaked in milk and eggs and baked into a pudding sweetened with molasses and studded with dried fruit. The meal that fed the household was the meal that everything remaining had agreed to become. Chapter 10. Coffee, tea, and the art of drinking water in the early 1800s was not reliably safe, and most Americans knew this in the practical, empirical way that people know things they have learned from experience rather than from science. Wells could be contaminated by the outhouse too nearby. Streams accepted the runoff of farms upstream. Standing water harboured the things that made people sick in the summer, with the particular violence that cholera and typhoid, brought to American communities throughout the century. The germ theory of disease would not become medically accepted until the 1860s and 1870s, so the connection between contaminated water and illness was understood practically before it was understood causally. People knew that drinking from certain sources at certain times of year made you sick. They did not know why. The practical response was to drink things that were not water: hard cider, small beer, whiskey diluted in water, coffee, tea. These were not exclusively beverages of preference or tradition. They were beverages of safety. This context explains the whiskey at the breakfast table, which otherwise requires some adjustment to comprehend. A dram of whiskey, a small pour, not a drinking glass, a quantity measured in ounces rather than cups, before or with the morning meal was a custom in many American households of the early 1800s, and it was offered to workers and visitors as a matter of ordinary hospitality. Distilled spirits killed the organisms in water that made water dangerous, and while the mechanism was not understood, the result was observed, and the result was that people who drank whiskey instead of water got sick less often from waterborne causes. The body politic of early 1800s America was an essentially bibulous one, and the quantities involved, the 7 gallons of spirits per capita per year recorded in 1830, are less surprising when understood against the background of genuinely unsafe water. The temperance movement arose partly in response to the genuine social damage that this level of drinking produced: domestic violence, poverty, accident, the abandonment of families, but its rise through the 1830s and 1840s changed the American beverage landscape at the table in ways that shaped what we drink today, as whiskey before breakfast became socially unacceptable in communities influenced by temperance organizing. Coffee stepped into the morning role that spirits had occupied, providing the warmth and stimulation of the early hours through caffeine rather than alcohol, and without the social disapproval that attached to spirits in the increasingly temperance-influenced decades of the mid-century. Coffee in the 1800s. American kitchen bore almost no resemblance to the coffee available today in any of the forms that modern convenience has produced. It was purchased as green beans, unroasted, hard, pale, at the general store, where they were sold by the pound from large sacks. The roasting happened in the kitchen, in a long-handled iron pan held over the fire and shaken constantly to keep the beans moving as they darkened from pale green to tan to brown, to the deep mahogany that indicated full roasting. A few minutes beyond that and they were burnt, and burning was easy because the colour change happened quickly near the end, and the fire in the hearth or stove was an imprecise instrument. The roasted beans were cooled, then ground in a small iron mill mounted to the kitchen wall or in a hand-cranked wooden box, and the ground coffee went directly into the pot. The pot was usually a tin or iron boiler, not a percolator, which would not appear until later in the century, but simply a vessel in which ground coffee and cold water were combined and heated together until the mixture boiled, then set off the heat to allow the grounds to settle. Eggshells or a beaten egg were sometimes added to the boiling coffee, and served the practical function of causing the grounds to clump together and sink faster, leaving the liquid above them clearer. The result, when well made, was coffee of a strength that modern coffee culture might describe as espresso adjacent. Dark, strongly flavoured, not bitter exactly, but serious in the way that something needs to be when it is being asked to perform the function of starting the day. It was drunk black in most households, or with cream if the dairy was producing well, or with a small amount of sugar if the budget permitted, and it was drunk hot from a thick ceramic cup in the kitchen before the rest of the house was fully awake. Tea was the refined beverage, the beverage of the parlour rather than the kitchen, of company rather than of family, of aspiration rather than sustenance, at least in the households that could make that distinction. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 had done complex things to the cultural standing of tea in America. It had made tea political, and then, in the years after, had made it associated with British allegiance in ways that created a slow, durable shift toward coffee as the patriotic beverage. By the 1830s and 1840s, coffee had largely supplanted tea as the everyday American morning drink, and tea had acquired the somewhat formal quality it retained through the century. Still drunk, still appreciated, but carrying a slightly more deliberate quality than coffee, requiring the better pot and the better cups, and a moment of intention that the workday morning coffee poured from an iron boiler did not require. Herbal teas, though they were not called teas in a century that reserved the word for the real article, were the medicinal beverages of the household, prepared from the dried herbs of the kitchen garden and from wild-crafted plants collected in the woods and fields. Chamomile steeped in hot water was for sleep and stomach complaints. Peppermint tea was for digestion and headache. Sassafras root bark, simmered until the water turned a pinkish red, was a spring tonic widely believed to thin the blood and restore health after the heaviness of winter diet. Ginger root in hot water with molasses was the universal cold remedy, and it worked, not because it killed the virus, which was not an available concept, but because the warmth and the ginger's volatile oils opened the sinuses and the molasses provided energy, and the hot liquid soothed the throat, and this combination was enough to produce a feeling of improvement. Hard cider was the everyday beverage of much of the country through the first half of the century, and particularly in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, where apple orchards were established and productive. Hard cider required only apples and thyme, pressed fresh in autumn, allowed to ferment in barrels through the cold months. It was ready to drink by midwinter and kept improving through spring. The alcohol content was relatively low compared to whiskey, 3 to 7%, roughly comparable to modern beer, and it could be drunk in quantity without the same immediate effects. Children drank it in its weaker forms. Workers drank it through the day. It was as ordinary as water and more reliable, and the farm families who produced their own cider had a self-sufficiency in beverage that needed no general store or supply chain to maintain. Whiskey itself was made in great quantities on American farms, particularly in the Scotch-Irish communities of the Appalachian Mountains and the Kentucky backcountry, where the distillation of corn and rye into spirits was a way of making surplus grain portable and storable and tradable in a landscape where roads were poor and markets were far. A bushel of corn was bulky and perishable. The same corn converted to whiskey was concentrated, kept indefinitely, and could be carried on horseback to market. The small still was a piece of farm equipment in these communities, as normal and as practical as the plough, and the whiskey it produced was used medicinally, traded for other goods, consumed daily in modest quantities, and produced in the particular quantities that resulted in America's 1830 per capita consumption record that has not been approached since. By mid-century, as the temperance movement gained real cultural traction, and as commercial coffee became cheaper and more widely available through the expanding railroad network, the American beverage landscape began its gradual shift toward what it would become by 1900. Coffee as the morning standard, tea for the refined occasion, water increasingly safe in urban areas with improved infrastructure, and hard liquor retreating from the daily table to the saloon and the medicine chest. The children who grew up in households that had abandoned the morning whiskey by 1850 were the generation that fought the Civil War, and the generation that returned from it encountered a country in which the relationship with drinking had become complicated and contested in ways it had not been when their grandparents poured the morning dram as a matter of simple course. The last cup of coffee in the 1800s household was made in the evening. Sometimes, if the household had enough coffee and the evening was cold and long, and there were people sitting together near the fire with nothing demanding their attention for the next few hours. It was weaker than the morning coffee, the same grounds reused, the pot refilled with water and brought back to the simmer rather than a full boil, and it was drunk slowly, without urgency, in the way that things are consumed in the evening when the day's work is finished, and the fire is burning low, and the conversation has reached the comfortable stage where people are no longer saying much, because there is not much left to say that has not already been said, and the silence between words is not awkward, but simply warm. The supper dishes are cleared, and the clearing of them is one of the last loud activities of the day. The scrape of pewter against wood, the sound of water poured from the kettle into the wash basin, the clink of cups set on the shelf. The children have been fed and are moving toward the end of their energy in that final heavy way that children have, the restlessness giving way to a settled, less directed kind of presence near the hearth, close to the warmth without quite asking for it. The kitchen smells of everything the day put into it. The morning's cornmeal mush has left its sweet starchiness in the air. The salt pork from supper has left its fat and salt. The bread baked this afternoon is a faint sweetness underneath the rest, warm and slightly yeasty. The smell of bread cooling on the rack near the window where you set it to finish. These smells overlap without competing. They have been building all day and they have found their equilibrium, and the equilibrium smells like the household itself, like the particular combination of what this family eats and how this kitchen cooks it, which is as distinctive as a face. The fire is lower now. You do not need as much heat as the cooking required, and the fire knows this and has settled into a quieter register. Not the purposeful energy of the cooking hours, but a steady, slower burn that will warm the room through the evening and provide enough coals for the morning's banking. The light it gives is orange and uneven, and it moves on the walls in the way that firelight moves, which is without pattern and without repetition, never the same twice. This is the light that 1800s America spent its evenings in, and it was not considered dim or insufficient. It was simply light, and light was what the evening needed. The kettle has been pushed to the cool side of the hearth, and sits there making the small sounds of metal contracting as it loses the heat of the cooking hours. A tick, a faint creak, the settled sigh of iron that has been working all day and is now allowed to rest. The pot hook, where the big bean pot hung through the afternoon, is empty. The bean pot itself is on the table, its lid fitted close, holding what is left for tomorrow. Nothing in this kitchen is wasted on a Tuesday evening in 1845. Nothing that can be saved is not saved. The leftover beans for tomorrow's meal, the bread heels for the bread pudding the day after, the pot liquor in the bottom of the salt pork pot for the greens at the end of the week. Somewhere in the house, a child has given up the evening entirely and gone still, the particular stillness of a sleeping child that is different from any other kind of stillness, a weight at the centre of it, a depth of surrender that adults almost never achieve. The dog is in his place near the fire. The cat is somewhere invisible, as cats always are, occupying the dark behind the wood box or the shadow at the top of the stairs, with the complete authority that cats bring to whatever space they choose. Outside the kitchen window the night has fully arrived. The sky above the farm holds whatever the season has put there, a moon in its phase, or none, and the stars if clouds have not gathered. The barn is a dark shape, the woodpile is a darker shape, the kitchen garden is invisible from here but present, the soil holding the warmth of the day a little longer than the air above it, the last of the summer herbs still standing in their rows, the cabbages solid and patient in their heads. Everything outside is doing the same thing the kitchen is doing, which is cooling and settling and moving toward the long quiet of the night. You cover the bread with a cloth and set it in its place. You bank the fire with the practised motion of every evening, the ash scraper moving the coals to the centre of the hearth, the larger piece of ash drawn over them, the draught lever eased closed on the stove. If it is a stove year, the damper turned. The fire beneath will keep its heart through the hours of darkness, and be there in the morning when you come back to it, and this continuity, the fire persisting unseen through the night, holding the possibility of the morning, is one of the small, unspoken reliabilities that the 1800s household depended on so completely that most households did not remark on it, the way you do not remark on the things that simply hold. The kitchen does not need you any more tonight. The day has been fed. The household has been sustained through another complete circuit of fire and meal and clearing and rest. The cornmeal is in the canister, the salt pork barrel is in the cellar, the bean bin has what it had this morning, less the portion of the day's eating. The work of tomorrow has been left arranged so that morning hands can find it easily. The pot on the crane, the kindling near the hearth, the meal in the bowl with a cloth over it. What remains of the day is this: the warmth of the cooling kitchen, the light of the subsiding fire, the sounds of a house settling towards sleep, the tick of the clock if the household has a clock, the small domestic movements of the last person still awake making their way through the dark, a candle carried up the stairs, its light moving on the walls in the unsteady way of all carried light, here and then not here, illuminating a hand on a rail, a face turning away from the draught. The American table of the 1800s has fed everyone it needed to feed today. It has done what tables have always done and always will do. It has gathered people, given them what the season and the labour could provide, and let them go. The gathering and the giving and the letting go. This is the whole of it, really. This is what the bread and the beans and the salt pork and the cornmeal mush and the butter and the morning coffee and the evening quiet have been about across the whole long century, in every kitchen, at every fire. Sleep well. Let the kitchen go dark now. Let the fire settle to its coals. The house is quiet. The night has fully arrived, and there is nothing left to do in it. Somewhere in a farmhouse in Ohio in 1847, a fire burns low in the hearth. The coals are banked under ash. The kitchen holds the warmth of the day's cooking, slowly releasing it into the room. The cornmeal mush bowl is clean on the shelf. The bread is wrapped in cloth on the table. The salt pork barrel waits in the cellar, patient and cold. Let your breathing slow. You have been fed. The day has been long, and it is over, and the table has been cleared, and the fire is low, and there is nothing more the evening requires of you. The smell of wood ash, the smell of cooling bread, the faint sweetness of the molasses jug on the pantry shelf, its stopper fitted, its darkness pooled inside. The night is deep and still. The animals in the barn are settled. The dog is in his place. The children are asleep with the completeness of the very tired, breathing slowly, their bodies given over entirely to the rest that the day earned. Let yourself go the same way. The work is finished. The morning will come back, and the fire will be lit, and the mush pot will go on, and the day will begin again with all its familiar requirements. But that is morning, and morning is far away, and between here and there is only the long quiet of the night. Let the sounds of the house settle around you, the tick of the cooling iron, the breath of the fire, the deep silence of a landscape that has no electric light in it, no engine sound, only the dark and the stars and the occasional voice of an owl in the woodlot carrying its question into the cold air and receiving no answer that you can hear. Your body is warm, your mind is slowing. The sentry has closed its kitchen door for the night, and there is nothing behind it now but the coals and the warmth and the slow, steady breathing of a house at rest. Let go of the day. Let go of the table, the fire, the bread, the barrel. Let the 1800s kitchen fade the way all things fade at the edge of sleep, gently, without drama, like wood smoke rising through cold air until it becomes indistinguishable from the air itself. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to hear about next, feel free to leave it in the comments. If you are drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well.